Do you ever remember that one weird teacher from high school, or that time this school was put in lockdown? Today we've got high school horror stories. Before we begin, if you think you might fall asleep, please introduce yourself in the comments, and while you're there, please like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm always interested in knowing what country everyone is from, so let us know in the comments, and share what time it is where you are. Thank you once more for joining me. Get cozy, grab a glass of water, turn the lights off, and make sure you've locked your door. Don't forget to say hello in the comments. It's time to close your eyes. High school was typically uneventful until the day Alex showed up. He was a quiet, strange guy, always seen alone in the hallways. At first, there was nothing remarkable about him, but after a few weeks, things began to change. One day, I noticed he was doodling in his notebook during class. It started innocently enough, just random scribbles. But over time, his drawings became disturbing. I started to notice oddly dark tones to his doodles. Twisted faces, distorted creatures, and strange symbols filled the pages. There was one lesson with Alex that changed everything. Tyrone was a typical bully and problem child. He would torment almost everyone equally. Today, Alex was his victim. He grabbed Alex's notebook and started looking through his drawings and loudly mocking him. I don't know what came over me, but I half-jokingly shouted Tyrone's name and said, "Leave him alone." I awkwardly laughed as to not become Tyrone's next target. Suddenly, someone at the front of the class tripped over a box, and Tyrone's attention was completely pulled away from us. You should have seen the look on Alex's face. I don't think I'd ever seen him smile until now. He was sat there with his notebook in hand, staring at me with the creepiest grin. He thanked me and muttered something to himself about not having to kill anyone today. It reminded me of Gollum from Lord of the Rings. After that day, he was practically my shadow. He'd follow me everywhere, always standing a few steps away from me. He didn't ever have much to say, but he would occasionally make comments about people like Tyrone, and we'd all laugh at how dark his humor was. Over time, he started sharing his drawings with me. They were all pretty messed up. He even had some detailed drawings of Tyrone being tortured or stabbed. On the odd occasion when he did speak, the things he would say were unsettling, muttering about hidden threats and the consequences that were coming. Looking back, it was so obvious what he was going to do, but I kind of convinced myself he just had a dark humor and used his drawings to vent. There were a few notable moments with him over the next few months. He would aggressively defend me in the hallway whenever someone would barge into me. He'd push people out of my way and do these really weird death stares at anyone that would bother me. He was very attached to me and protective. It seemed like as the days went on, he just became more and more angry at the world, muttering more about what he wanted to do to people, telling me that I'm one of the good ones and that he'll never let them hurt me. Towards the end of winter, Alex had a week off school and I started to wonder if he was alright. I'd also noticed at this point that his locker started to smell really bad. I knew his code because I'd seen him put it in so many times, and he didn't seem to care that I would watch. I guess curiosity got the better of me, and I entered his code and opened his locker door. I can't describe just how powerful the smell was. It didn't just knock me back, it sent me into a coughing fit. It was obvious now why it stank so much. I probably don't need to tell you what I found. A collection of small animals. I remember a cat, a rabbit, and some mice. I immediately closed the door again and started to panic. I knew I couldn't just ignore this. I immediately told my teacher about what I'd seen, knowing I might get into trouble for accessing someone else's locker. They ended up closing the whole corridor and getting the police involved. They found multiple hunting knives and all of his disturbing drawings. We never did find out about what happened to him other than the fact that he was kicked out of school and some more security measures were put in place to prevent weapons being brought into school. I don't know what he was planning, or if it was just animals he liked killing, but I feel like if I didn't check his locker, he might have come back and done something seriously bad. I remember the first day when we had this substitute teacher, Mr. Roberts. He had a reputation that spread like wildfire among the students. Everyone said he was weird and would creep everyone out. That day, I was about to find out for myself. Mr. Roberts walked into our classroom, and right from the start, something felt off. He had this unnerving way of looking at each one of us, as if he was sizing us up. His eyes were piercing, like he was trying to see into our souls. As the lesson began, he spoke in a monotone voice that made it hard to stay awake. He covered a subject that should have been interesting but somehow managed to make it utterly boring. I glanced around the room, and my classmates had expressions of utter boredom or mild discomfort. What really creeped me out, though, were his mannerisms. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was more of a grimace than anything resembling happiness. His movements were jerky and erratic, like he couldn't control his own body. Towards the end of the lesson, some of my classmates decided to test the waters. They asked him personal questions, trying to get to know him better. But his responses were strange. He'd laugh at random moments and make bizarre comments that left us scratching our heads. Then came the incident that really got my guard up. One of my classmates, Alex, asked about his past teaching experiences. Mr. Roberts hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the room. Then, in a low, almost whispered voice, he said,
"I've taught in many places, but they were all temporary."
It was as if he was hinting at something darker, something he didn't want us to know. The room fell silent, and everyone felt the awkwardness. We had him twice in the same day, and the afternoon lesson was even more weird than the one in the morning. Mr. Roberts' behavior only grew more unsettling. He would suddenly stop talking mid-sentence and stare blankly at the back of the classroom, clearly lost in his thoughts. Then, without warning, he'd snap back to reality and continue as if nothing had happened. When the final bell rang, the whole class breathed a collective sigh of relief. We couldn't get out of that classroom fast enough. As I walked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Roberts was hiding something that made him more than just a creepy substitute. And I hoped I wouldn't have to see him again anytime soon. Our history teacher disappeared halfway through the year, and Mr. Roberts took over our class. We'd see him twice a week. Whenever I was in his classes, I would do my best to just focus on my studies. The rest of the school year passed without any serious incidents, just the regular blank staring and growing rumors about how weird he was. Towards the end of the year, after we'd all kinda gotten used to his demeanor, Mr. Roberts crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. During a history lesson, he made a bizarre and inappropriate comment about one of the female students. It was so disturbing that the student immediately reported it to the school authorities. The school administration acted swiftly, launching an investigation into Mr. Roberts' past. It didn't take long for them to uncover a disturbing criminal history. He had been involved in a series of troubling incidents at his previous schools, including allegations of inappropriate behavior and comments. The revelation sent shockwaves through our school, and parents demanded answers. How had the school hired someone with such a dark past? The school board faced intense scrutiny, and many called for a complete overhaul of the hiring process. Mr. Roberts was immediately suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. As more details emerged about his past, it became clear that he should never have been allowed near children. The school took responsibility for its failure to properly vet him and promised to implement stricter hiring practices in the future. While Mr. Roberts was never seen at the school again, the unsettling feeling that had hung over our classroom didn't dissipate easily. The incident served as a chilling reminder of how important it was to remain vigilant and speak up when something didn't seem right. It's weird because people who had his lessons actually improved their grades. He wasn't a bad teacher, just a bad person. After he disappeared, there were multiple rumors about him working at another school a few miles away. I always wonder what happened with him. I was a junior in high school when it all started. Mr. Simmons, our English teacher, had always been a bit eccentric, but this year, something changed. He became fixated on me, and it became incredibly uncomfortable. At first, it was harmless. He would compliment my essays or ask me to stay after school to discuss my studies. I didn't think much of it, assuming he was just trying to be a helpful teacher. But soon, it escalated. He started showing up at places he shouldn't have known about, my part-time job at the local bookstore or my favorite coffee shop. Every time, he'd strike up a conversation, making it clear he'd been tracking my activities. It was unnerving, but I hesitated to say anything, fearing it might be a misunderstanding. Then came the gifts, flowers left on my doorstep, anonymous notes in my locker, and even a mixtape of romantic songs. It became impossible to deny that something was terribly wrong. The final straw was when he cornered me after school, professing his love and suggesting we go away together. I knew I couldn't handle this on my own. I confided in my closest friends, who immediately took action. They encouraged me to report Mr. Simmons to the principal. We compiled evidence, texts, notes, and witness accounts of his strange behavior. When we confronted the principal, she was shocked but supportive. She assured us she would investigate the matter thoroughly. What we didn't expect was the revelation that Mr. Simmons had a history of similar obsessions with students at his previous schools. The investigation unveiled a disturbing pattern of predatory behavior. Parents were outraged, and the local news caught wind of the scandal. Eventually, the police got involved, and Mr. Simmons was arrested. Most people were furious about the fact that he'd already been caught doing this in the past. Why was he allowed to teach again? Did the school know about his past, or did they not even check? You'd think we'd have better systems to protect children from predators like this. I have an unforgettable memory of when our school went into lockdown. I remember it perfectly. It was the end of 7th grade. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. We were in math class. This classroom had one entrance in the corner of the room, and all the windows were on the opposite wall from that door. There were no windows facing the hallway. Our teacher, Mr. Anderson, was in the middle of explaining algebraic equations when the loudspeaker crackled to life. Principal Johnson's voice echoed through the classroom, ordering an immediate lockdown. The classroom plunged into darkness as Mr. Anderson snapped off the lights. Panic rippled through my classmates. We shuffled towards the corner, trying to remain quiet while some of us were getting emotional. We'd only practiced this once before, so we were quite disorganized, and our teacher had to keep quietly reminding us to hide in the corner behind our desks. My desk neighbor Sarah started crying and asking me what was happening. I shrugged and told her I wasn't sure. I remember my heart pounding against my ribcage. Minutes felt like hours. We huddled together, anxiously waiting for any information. The classroom windows were veiled with heavy curtains, so we couldn't see outside. Mr. Anderson maintained his composure, but I could sense his fear. It had been a while since we'd heard anything, and nobody had a phone back then, so we were completely in the dark. As our teacher approached the door to listen, a loud crash echoed through the corridor, causing everyone to freeze on the spot. The sudden deafening noise was followed by a series of sharp bangs, as if something were violently striking the classroom doors. Fear swept through us like wildfire, and my heart pounded in my chest. Our teacher's face went pale. Even in the dark I could see his face from the little bit of light that peeked through the side of the door. The banging on the doors continued, growing louder and more relentless with each passing moment. It was so intense that I could feel the walls vibrating each time. The intercom was painfully silent. Our imaginations ran wild, conjuring up all sorts of scenarios. Was there an intruder in the school? A dangerous criminal? A student going on a rampage? Out of nowhere there were screams from down the hallway. The screaming intensified as we could hear repeated banging on the doors and the sounds of windows being smashed. The sound was full of panic, and we couldn't fathom what was happening outside. Time stretched on, the banging or screaming showing no sign of stopping. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor. I held my breath, and my eyes darted towards the classroom door. All I heard was a barrage of shouting men. Some giving direct orders, others seemingly just shouting as loud as possible. It was like a battle cry. Just a bunch of men roaring like animals. The noise was only amplified by the echoing hallway. The banging and screaming stopped, and a few minutes later we noticed a shadow at the door. The doorknob slowly turned, and it creaked open. My pulse quickened as I braced for the worst. Shadows danced at the entrance, and we all stared wide-eyed at the intruder. But what stepped into our classroom wasn't a menacing figure. It was Mr. Thompson, the school's custodian. Relief washed over us as we realized we were safe. Mr. Thompson calmed us all down before explaining that a bear had wandered onto the school grounds. The culprit behind our traumatizing experience was a large frightened bear. It had let itself in through one of the doors to the yard and then panicked when it closed behind it. The staff were trying to open the door again and coach it out from the outside, but their attempts just pushed it deeper into the school and it started to panic. That's why it was attacking the doors and ended up causing so much chaos. As we exited the lockdown, our adrenaline was still pumping. But now it was mixed with an overwhelming feeling of relief. That visit from a bear was something we'd remember for the rest of our lives. My middle school was once on lockdown, and I was actually somewhat a part of it. When our bus pulled up to the school, the doors opened and our principal and a few police got on the bus. There were police cars around the parking lot, and my principal pointed at 4 of us and told us to get off the bus and go with them. We headed to the school and then into the principal's office. We sat down in there and then he asked us, "Why do you guys think you are here today?" One of the kids in there, I wouldn't really call him my friend, just someone I talked with at school, replied, "Mr. Principal, I heard someone was bringing a gun into school today." The principal looks directly into my eyes with a seriously fear-inducing stare. He says, "Yes. And I heard this person was bringing the gun in for you." When he said, "this person," it was clear he was hinting at me. And considering I had nothing to do with this, I thought this was hilarious but also terrifying. Damn, you could have heard a pin drop in the room with that silence. They'd already taken our bags off us for a search, and we had cops stood behind us, staring at us the whole time. The first guy, the one who had said he heard someone was bringing a gun in, finally decided to come clean. He just said, "You've got the wrong Michael." They'd already checked our bags, and at this point they started to pat us down. They saw that I clearly didn't have a gun, so the principal told me and my other friend to sit out in the lobby. While we were waiting in the hallway, we saw the officers following one of the teachers down towards the classrooms. Then our principal announced over the intercom that we were in lockdown. The kid they went looking for, his name was Michael, which is also my name. He brought a gun into school that day for the other guy in the office. The school said the gun was unloaded, but I don't know if I believe that. From what I heard, the gun was going to be given to the other kid because there was supposed to be a fight after school that day, and he wanted a way to protect himself if things got out of hand. The reason I was taken into the office with them is since the kid who brought the gun in was named Michael, they assumed that it was me. It kind of bothered me that I was searched by the police and treated like a criminal because they hadn't bothered to check which Michael might be more likely to bring a gun in. I was a super quiet teenager, never got into any trouble, and the other Michael was always in detention, would get into fights constantly, literally already had an incident with a gun in the past, and yet they heard the name Michael and assumed it would be me. I didn't even get an apology. Just sent back to my class once lockdown was over. My school was a place where not much ever really happened. But one sunny afternoon, things got real weird. School was the same old routine, teachers doing their teaching, and us students just trying to keep our eyes open. I was in Mrs. Patterson's class when we started hearing whispers. The rumors going around were that there had been some strange sightings outside. One girl said that she was followed as she came in late. Another guy said he saw someone trying to climb the side of the school. Outside, it was a typical blue sky day, but with what we'd all been hearing, the bright summer's day managed to have an element of creepiness to it. The hallways were typically silent during class, but that day I heard at least a few times some hurried footsteps and teachers shouting out of their class, occasionally reminding the noisemakers that they should be silent. Recess came, but it felt different. No laughter, no shouting, just a strange quiet. We all stared at the trees around the schoolyard, wondering what the heck was up. Something wasn't right, but none of us wanted to come right out and say it. As the day wore on, the rumors got wilder. Some kids claimed they'd seen a guy lurking behind the trees, looking all scruffy and stumbling around. Others swore they heard mumbling coming from inside the school. Mrs. Patterson tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just our imaginations or maybe some lost hiker. But as the afternoon rolled along, we were all getting jumpy. Those odd sounds outside were getting louder, and people in the class were starting to lose it. Finally, Principal Mr. O'Connor made an announcement that we had to go into lockdown. Fear ran through the school as teachers rushed us back to our classrooms. We sat there in silence, waiting and wondering what the heck was happening. Minutes ticked by, each one filled with those strange sounds outside. Then, we heard police sirens. We all listened closely, hearts pounding in our chests. A loud bang echoed through the hallway, making all of us jump in our seats. Someone was pounding on the classroom door next to us, their fists hitting it with a force that made the walls creak. The screams of terror down the hallway grew louder. Mr. O'Connor showed up at our classroom door, beads of sweat on his forehead. He looked like he'd just dodged a bullet. "Stay here," he said, his voice shaking. "The police are here, and they'll sort everything out." There was a bunch of commotion outside the classroom, further down the hallway. Police were shouting at a guy to get down and show his hands. We could hear the guy shouting back at them, slurring his speech and saying something about not leaving until he gets her. Eventually, we saw him being dragged out in handcuffs. The teachers found it impossible to calm us down at that point. Parents were coming into school to collect their children, and teachers had given up trying to teach anything. It turns out he was the father of a girl in another class. He had a big fallout with her mother and gotten drunk or high and came to pick up his girl after the mother threatened to never let him see her again. In the end, the whole thing was just sad rather than scary, but at the time it was the scariest thing that had ever happened to most of us. When I left home to attend university in the UK, I knew I was in for a big change. I moved quite far away from family and friends, leaving behind the familiar comforts of home. Always a social person, this new environment was a challenge for me. My student studio apartment felt empty, and my course had fewer sociable students than I'd expected. Desperate to make friends, I turned to Tinder and Instagram, hoping to connect with like-minded people. However, luck wasn't on my side. Conversations often fizzled out, and it felt like a struggle to find genuine connections. Then, out of nowhere, a ray of hope emerged. A cute girl, Emily, added me on Instagram. I'd linked my Instagram handle in my Tinder bio, and she must have seen it there. She was stunning, and I couldn't believe my luck. We started chatting, and it seemed like we hit it off. She mentioned wanting to meet up, and without much thought, I gave her my address. The excitement of potentially making a new friend overshadowed any reservations I might have had. However, as we continued chatting, something didn't quite add up. Emily's Instagram photos didn't seem to be taken anywhere near the city I was in. Moreover, she was far too attractive to be interested in a guy like me. I noticed that her comments and followers were predominantly men. Doubt crept in, and I began to suspect that I'd given my details to a random catfish account. My anxiety peaked, and I decided to block her immediately. It was the only sensible thing to do. I hoped I dodged a potential scam. But then, things took an even more unsettling turn. Another strikingly attractive girl, Sarah, began messaging me. The conversation started precisely where I'd left off with Emily, as if it had never stopped. Alarm bells rang in my head, and I knew I'd messed up. They had my personal details, including my address. With a heavy heart, I asked Sarah to leave me alone and blocked her as well. But it didn't stop there. Soon after, yet another attractive girl sent me a friend request. By this point, I was fed up. I stopped replying, thinking it best to protect myself. I double-checked that my studio apartment door was locked and went to bed, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. However, my rest was short-lived. In the dead of night, I heard someone trying to force their way into my room, shouting my name. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. Sleep paralysis gripped me, rendering me helpless. I'd experienced sleep paralysis almost every night since being at my new studio. It always happened when I was someplace new, but I never saw or heard anything. The door eventually creaked open, and a strange man entered my room. He rifled through my belongings as I lay there, unable to stop him. My heart raced, and my mind raced even faster, trying to comprehend the whole thing. After what felt like an eternity, the intruder left, shutting the door behind him. My sleep paralysis gradually released its grip, and I awoke in a cold sweat, scanning my room for signs of the intrusion. Everything appeared normal, and I couldn't be sure if anyone had actually broken in. I reported the incident to university security, but they found no evidence of a break-in. I genuinely didn't know if I'd imagined the whole thing. The next chilling discovery was that both the accounts, Emily's and Sarah's, had disappeared entirely. It felt so real. There was absolutely a man in my room going through my stuff. I saw it with my own eyes. I've had sleep paralysis many times, and I was always able to accurately recount what was going on around me, so why would I be wrong this time? I removed my Instagram from my Tinder bio and made sure to barricade my door every night. My social life was pretty much dead for the rest of the year, and I didn't sleep well at all. I used to be an avid Twitter user. It used to be my go-to app for wasting time, scrolling through tweets, and catching up on the latest memes. Over time, I had grown somewhat immune to the occasional creepy direct message. I had learned to ignore them, to just brush them off as part of the experience. One evening, I received a notification about a new follower. It was a name I didn't recognize, and the profile picture was a little blurry, but nothing immediately sent alarm bells ringing. I followed the account back as I usually would and immediately received a message. I decided to open it, even though I was sure it was spam. Inside the DM was a link to another Twitter profile, Secret Tweets. My curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the link. The profile was filled with a series of photos, each featuring different people seemingly caught off guard. Some were on public transportation, others on park benches, and a few even seemed to be in the privacy of their own homes. What made it weird was that none of these people appeared to be aware they were being photographed. As I continued scrolling through the account, expecting to find crude or inappropriate comments, I was met with an odd sight. The comments on the posts were not what I expected. The comments were all just numbers getting gradually higher and higher, stuff like 700, 750, 800, 1000. This was the same under every single post. People writing slightly larger numbers in reply to the last person. The oddest part of all was that every single account that commented appeared to be spam accounts. No profile pictures, no followers, they were just anonymous accounts with no profile set up. I decided to report the account and sent the link to my friend Becky. Still, I didn't give it too much thought, and I continued with my day, attending classes and getting lost in assignments. It wasn't until later, after school, that Becky finally replied to my message. Her response was a mix of shock and concern, urging me to report it to the police right away. Her reaction bewildered me, and I questioned why she was so alarmed. Her reply was chilling. "Why are you not worried about someone posting pictures of you on their Twitter?" I quickly returned to the profile, my heart racing. Amongst the unsettling images, I found photos of myself, pictures taken without my knowledge while I walked home from college. I remembered seeing a parked car that day, but I didn't think much of it at the time. My heart sank as I realized that the profile had images of me, just like the others, taken without my consent. The same trend was happening under the pictures of me. Faceless accounts writing numbers, 1300, 1400, 1800. I kept refreshing, watching the number replies come through, and that's when it all clicked. 2000, with a $sign next to it. My heart dropped and I refreshed again. The tweet was deleted and replaced with just the number 2000. They were bidding. They were offering payment, but for what? Fear gripped me as I comprehended the gravity of the situation. I reported the account to Twitter and contacted the police, providing every detail I could recall. With trembling hands, I locked myself in my room, talking to Becky over the phone, all while being home alone. Hours crawled by, and when I eventually refreshed the Twitter page, I was met with an unsettling message. This page does not exist. My heart pounded in my chest. Becky confirmed the same result. To this day, I don't know if Twitter removed it or if the person behind the account deactivated it. The cryptic numbers in the comments remain a mystery. But one thing's for sure, it felt like a twisted setup, and I'm grateful not to know any more about what was happening with that Twitter page. A year ago, I used to post my entire life to Snapchat. It was my go-to app for sharing bits of my life with friends and family. But then something happened that made me reconsider my online presence. One day, out of the blue, I received a friend request from an unfamiliar username. I didn't think much of it at the time and accepted the request without a second thought. It was just another random person, or so I assumed. Months passed, and I forgot about that peculiar friend request. My life went on, and I continued sharing snippets of my daily activities on Snapchat. Little did I know that someone was watching, very closely. It started innocently enough, with an unexpected snap. I opened it, thinking it was probably a friend sharing a funny meme or a cute pet photo. But as the image loaded, my heart skipped a beat. It was an eerie, edited version of an old Snapchat story I had posted months ago. Floating love hearts surrounded the image, and the caption read, "Can't wait to see you." The chill running down my spine was hard to ignore. How did someone get access to my old stories? Who was behind this? Days turned into weeks, and more edited snaps kept arriving. Each one featured pictures taken from my past stories. The captions became increasingly unsettling, referring to my personal life. "How was your McDonald's on Friday?" And another said, "I loved that movie you watched last night." The sense of being watched was inescapable. I felt exposed and vulnerable, as though a stranger had invaded my privacy. It wasn't long before I decided to check Snap Maps, the feature that lets you see the real-time locations of your friends. My heart raced as I zoomed in on the map. There it was, a bit too close for comfort, the location of this creep. He was nearby, and the thought sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary prank or trolling. It felt personal, like someone was playing mind games with me. Fear gripped me as I realized the mysterious friend was getting closer to my location. I knew I had to act fast. I began taking screenshots of the disturbing snaps for evidence. Then, I contacted the local authorities and reported the unsettling situation. The investigation that followed uncovered the identity of the creep. To my shock, it turned out to be someone I met at a party months ago. I'd been warned about how creepy and weird he was. He would just invite himself to parties and nobody wanted to be rude and kick him out, so we just tolerated him. To be fair, I had no issue with him and spoke with him a little bit throughout the night, but didn't see much of him. I guess being nice to the social outcast when everyone else kept him at arm's length was enough for him to become obsessed with me. They didn't end up charging him with anything, but they told him to leave me alone and explained to me that I could get a restraining order, but it seemed pointless. I've worked a few random jobs in my life. My first one was a summer job at 16 during summer break at a dairy farm. I absolutely hated it there, and it made it harder for me to find the motivation to even try finding work again when the time came. I don't really remember how I was first referred to the job, but the following summer, I ended up working as an office assistant for a self-employed photographer. My parents knew her because she used to be a member of their church, and my sister attended her 4-H program when she had it. By that time, her health had begun to take a hit, as she claimed it was a mixture of things from chronic Lyme to fibromyalgia. I had also been warned by my parents that she was a little off. She was very religious and claimed to have had real encounters with demons, even participated in some exorcisms. I'm an atheist and a skeptic, so I never took her stories seriously. Aside from the weird things she would tell me, she was mostly harmless, and working for her was not very hard. The job basically required me to do a lot of data entry, as well as help prep her photos with some minor editing. She would also make me add her company watermark before uploading them. They'd end up on a site where her customers could browse them and then pick which ones they wanted to order. She primarily photographed horse events, dressage, stadium and cross-country jumping, etc. And for the first several months my job was in her living room, which was basically my office space at the time. Eventually, I was talked into tagging along at shows where she trained me as a photographer, and soon I was shooting at the events along with her. It was boring work, I won't lie. I'm not a horse person. But things didn't get weird until a year later when I learned the hard way it was not her that I needed to worry about. She had 2 sons. One who was out of state, the other who was in the Navy. The latter of the two, a guy called Nathan, I had only heard small things about. He was somewhere on the autism spectrum, but she was never clear on what exactly his diagnosis was. When he finally returned home and I met him for the first time while working in her living room, he seemed like a nice guy. A little odd, but not concerning. He was obsessed with movies, and being a bit of a movie buff myself, whenever he would venture to the living room to strike up a conversation, it would almost always be about whatever movies we were into or were excited to watch. I should point out here that I was 18 and he was in his mid-30s. At some point, he got it in his head that I was interested in him, though he never said anything directly to me. I had to find out about it from my parents. My mom worked as the secretary at the church, and Nathan somehow found out. I can only guess my boss had told him. One afternoon, Nathan showed up at my mom's desk and started gushing about his feelings. He talked about how much fun I was, how he loved talking to me, how he was planning to take me to the movies and take me to his church, and all these other plans he had for me. My mom was beyond uncomfortable, as was the pastor who happened to overhear it. And when I got home that night, she told me what had happened and suggested I make sure not to lead him on. I was completely baffled because I hadn't done anything. We'd never even discussed the possibility of doing anything together. I got even more uncomfortable around him over the next few weeks. I made an effort to acknowledge him less when he was around and keep the conversation short while stressing I had to do work. Eventually, he got his own place and moved out of his parents' house, so I figured the problem had solved itself. A couple years later, I had moved out, my boss's company had closed, and I was working somewhere else. I was friends with both my boss and Nathan on Facebook, and around that time I was finally coming out as an atheist, something I couldn't do while I was still living at home. One night, my old boss messaged me, asking about a ring I had on my finger. It was a black ring with a white solid star in the middle of a black circle. Already knowing where she was going with this, I told her it was just a ring. She started accusing me of wearing a pentagram because she didn't know what a pentacle was and that I was promoting Satan. I tried several times to explain to her that not only was it not that symbol, but that also paganism has nothing to do with the devil anyways, but she refused to listen, so I just ignored her. It was typical behavior of her and not worth the argument. The next morning, I had a message from Nathan telling me I needed to come to his church with him. I told him no, and the messages I received back gradually grew angrier and angrier. He went from asking to demanding I go with him. He told me I was lost and that I would not find the answers I needed by living the life I was. Eventually, he outright said he thought the fact that I was wearing a pentagram was disgusting and that I was opening myself up for possession. Knowing there would be even less of a point in arguing with him than there was with his mother, I went ahead and blocked both of them, deciding I was done with it all. Then he started showing up at my workplace. He would always search through the store until he found me, and then once he did, he would corner me and not stop talking to me no matter how many times I tried to dodge him or tell him I needed to get back to work. Eventually, the managers caught on and started intercepting him whenever he showed up. I wasn't making enough to pay the rent with that job, so I had to take up a second one. Within a week of working my second job, which was in a different town, he started showing up there. This time I told the managers who he was, and after that, every time he showed up, I was allowed to hide in the back room behind a locked door while they sped his order along and got him out. One of those many encounters, while I was hiding in the back, one of the managers was back there with me, inputting employee time punches into the computer when the both of us heard Nathan shout in our direction. "I know you remember me." That was the last straw for them, and they told him his business was no longer welcome there. He stopped showing up at my other job as well for a while. Fast forward to a few years later, I was getting used to not having to look over my shoulder every shift or check the parking lot for his truck. Then one day, he reappeared. He was browsing a section I was walking past when he spotted me and got this deer in the headlights look. I made a beeline to the break room because just seeing him made me scared. After that, he started showing up regularly. I would always find ways to dodge and avoid him, but he would still eventually spot me and know I was still there. I was debating whether or not to tell the managers, because at this point it had been a while since he had done anything, and saying something just because I was nervous didn't feel right. Call me a coward or an idiot, but that was my thought process. What happened next made me regret not speaking up. It was bound to happen eventually, but one night he managed to catch me while I was at the customer service desk. He approached me and said hi, and I immediately started to look for someone to signal over so I could make a break for it. But before I could say a word, he said something that made me feel sick. "How's your little girl doing?" "She's 3, right?" I looked at him, horrified. I had him completely blocked from all of my social media. I had his number blocked. I was living at a new address, and I had not seen or spoken to his mother since she confronted me about my ring. I had not told either of them I was a parent now, or that I was married, and I was not friends with anyone who knew them. "How's your husband doing?" "He's good." "He's a good man," I said, trying to reinforce the idea that I was not available to him and that I had no desire to have anything to do with him. "Really? Where does he work?" At this point, I felt like I was going to pass out. Thankfully, another employee approached, and I got the hell out of there. As I was leaving, he called out behind me. "I'll see you again. We'll talk. We'll go out and do something together." "We will." I reported him to the managers, telling them everything about the encounter, including all the information that he should not have had. They were able to pull up his face on CCTV, and while I have not heard anything, I'm guessing one of them finally managed to approach him because I haven't seen him since. This has been going on for 10 years and I want it to finally be over. If he shows up again, I'm going to the police, but I'm seriously hoping it never comes to that. I just want him to stop. I haven't seen him since the incident with my managers. I think he may have gotten scared off. Turned out one of my coworkers used to work with him too at a different job, and she also made a complaint about him to the managers. I don't know what they did with that information afterwards, but I know he hasn't shown up since. It sounds like they plan to call the cops if he sets foot in the store again. With 2 employee complaints of stalker-like behavior, they refuse to ignore that. In 2002, I was 14 years old, starting freshman year. I was an awkward, nerdy girl that didn't know how to handle attention from boys, so you could say I made things worse for my situation. I had a knack for making friends with the weird people no one liked, but I tried to be friendly with everyone I met, so it wasn't a big deal to me. Unfortunately, that was also my downfall. Clubs were a big deal, and they actually had an anime club, so of course I was all about that. First club meeting, I sat next to a couple of friends and soaked it all up. I thought I was finally with my people. Then here comes Stalker Kid. I'd use his real name, but to this day I have no clue what it is. He sat in front of me, and being that person, I said hi. I could tell he was uncomfortable and didn't know anyone, so I was just being nice. And boy, did this guy cling to me for that one word. At first, he would just find me during lunch and just stand there mumbling things to me. He had such a soft voice, high-pitched, mousy little guy, that you just felt unnerved when he spoke to you. The way he would look at you as he spoke, I could never look him in the eyes. After a while, it became more asking about my personal life and what I was into. Me being dumb and naive, I tried to be friendly and chat while feeling incredibly uncomfortable. After a while, me and my friends would move to different tables, benches, even hallways to avoid him, but he always found me. After about a year of this, my best friend finally told me that if I didn't tell him to F off, he would. I really didn't want him around anymore, so, sure, go ahead. So one day during lunch, here comes Stalker Kid with his signature greeting. Barely above a whisper. "Hey Nancy." My buddy just goes, "Dude, she's not interested, F off." Looking hurt, he shuffled away. I was like, man, you didn't have to be so hard on him, but thanks. I didn't see him much around school after that except for club days where he would just sit across the room and stare at me while my best friend glared at him. Cut to me being 16 and now driving to school. Minus the awkward club days, I didn't really notice anything from him. That is until an old gray beat-up car started parking next to me, extremely close. One day after school, he was waiting for me in that car. He started asking me how I'd been, talking about prom and all that stuff. I was trying to rack my brain on how he knew that was my car, unless he had been watching me before and after school. I started getting there later and leaving later to avoid him, because he was like clockwork. Finally, a boy I used to be friends with in elementary school was walking out with me and made a comment about how that guy is always next to my car and asked if he was my boyfriend. I immediately said no, and he's always following me around, and I hated it. It was really starting to freak me out. Bless this guy, because he walked right up to him and scared him off, threatening if he ever parked near me again he would kick his ass. I figured maybe that was enough to keep him away. So again, there was a small space where I would hear nothing of him except for my friends who had classes with him telling me how creepy he was. One friend had art class with him and said he would draw naked women constantly in his books. Junior year is wrapping up, and I started giving my best friend Jack lifts to school. He was on my way, so I figured why not. At some point, Jack started noticing that little gray car was always heading the same way after school and made a joke about Stalker Kid living next to him. Small world, right? I could only be so lucky. One day, as per usual, little gray car was following us, so we took a detour. Sure enough, he was with us every step of the way, and it was no longer a joke. We both started freaking out. I pushed the gas pedal as hard as my foot could push it and got the hell out of sight. A few other things happened. In order to get into prom, he had to ask someone from my year. So he asked some random girl from my softball team and then dumped her as soon as he got in. He then followed me all night. This includes to the after prom, where I had to avoid him the whole time. Our high school had a TV channel for kids to run, and during prom they would record the whole night. It took one of my friends to point it out, but throughout the whole video, it showed him behind me and following and staring at me all night. I didn't even realize. And the one that still creeps me out to this day is graduation for his class. I was scanning the crowd to see my friends who were graduating when I saw a hand wave as I passed by. I looked back, and of course it was Stalker Kid waving at me. How he picked me out of a crowd of thousands I will never know. 2006 senior year was great, no signs of creepy stalker kid, to the point where I kind of forget about him. I graduate, I choose a college in town, get a job at a local retail store and move on. Life was beginning to be normal. I work the gaming department, so you get the weird guys once in a while. One that I saw a lot was this little Mexican guy with glasses who never purchased anything but would just walk around from time to time. Then, stalker kid comes strolling in the doors and walks into gaming and just talks. I ask how he knew I worked here. He says his friend saw me and knew we were friends. I tried to radio for help for someone to come and get him out. Finally, a big guy from computers walks by and asks for my help in the back. Once he pulls me to safety, I tell him everything. From that point, security is aware and is told to watch for this guy. Of course, he wasn't doing anything physical, so all they could do for me is watch out for him. So every time he came in, they would tell me and I would dip back to the warehouse. I started seeing his friend, who he called Ninja, constantly, and all he ever did was walked around on his phone. I began to suspect he was texting Stalker Kid to tell him I was at work, because sure enough, 10 minutes later, he would come in. So I tested this theory and started walking randomly around the store. At one point, a friend who worked register asked why I would do this, so I had her take a walk with me on her break. I told her this ninja guy would follow us everywhere, even just going down a random aisle. Sure enough, he did, and she began freaking out. A few minutes later, I told her my stalker would walk through those doors. So I'm making my way to the warehouse, and out steps Ninja Guy from an aisle and he shouts, "She's right here." I just stared at him, like, what the hell do you think you're doing? Stalker Kid walks up behind me and asks why I'm always running away from him, and says that he lost my number and asks if I can give it to him again. I say sure, knowing damn well that I never gave it to him. I go to the warehouse to get a pen and paper. I wrote down, "This is where I work, don't ever come here again," and handed it to him. I told him and his friend to leave and called for security, who walked him out. Security tells me later that he also cried while they took him out. Later that day, as I'm leaving work, security offers to walk me to my car. I say sure. Stalker Kid is out by my car waiting for me, so this is where security says he's not having it, and calls the police, which we are conveniently next to their headquarters. He books it when he sees the car. Few years go by, nothing comes up. I buy a fancy new car, and don't see him much. I'm thinking that did the trick, and I'm finally free. 2012, my buddies and I are leaving work, ready to hit the night at the bar, per usual. We are all walking out the door, where we all have to stand and wait to hear the alarm sound to verify it's armed. As we are walking out, I hear it. That awful sound. "Hey Nancy." I cringe, grab my friend's arm and turn. There he is leaning on his car, waiting. My friend recognizes him and asks what he wants. Guy says he just wants to talk to me. He said he didn't ever see my car, so he didn't think I worked here anymore. His other friend is sitting in the back seat of his car just staring at me blankly. I start to think the worst. If my friends leave me here, something tells me I'm not coming into work the next day. Or ever. I'm terrified that he's had years of time to think about our last encounter where I wrote my number down and made him cry. I grab my friend's arm tighter. My friend kicks off, pretends to be my boyfriend and rips into him. My friend is about 2 feet taller and much bigger. They get into it, and I'm just standing in the parking lot and I'm just begging for my friend to kick his ass. He spooked Stalker Kid so bad that I'm pretty sure he pissed himself before getting in his car and booking it. Ever since, if he comes into the store, my friend stares him down from his office. Years later, I've moved on, gotten married, and moved out of town. Recently we've moved back to start a business, and to this day, I still feel myself looking behind me at stores on the off chance that I randomly bump into him. He caused me to have anxiety, mental and emotional pain, fear and trust issues for a decade. Even after moving on, I still feel the effects today. And I never even knew his name. I'll begin by giving a little background. At the time this happened, I was a 16-year-old girl working at a chain coffee place while in high school. I am 19 now, and in college, 7 hours away from this place. This happened at a time in my life in which I was super shy and had a tough time standing up for myself. In retrospect, I could have handled it a lot better. I used to work closing shifts with my best friend after school. It'd be from like 3 to 10 p.m. We worked at a relatively dead store, so we spent most of our time playing music and talking. We did our duties like taking the trash out and restocking, etc., although both of us always dreaded taking the trash out, as we had to go out back. The dumpsters were behind the store, in a dimly lit area, next to a sketchy liquor store. One night a man came in pretty late. It wasn't unusual to have customers come near closing. It was just uncommon to see anyone we didn't already know. Our store was mostly just regulars. He was lanky, and probably around 30. I mostly just remember his eyes. They were piercing, the type that never break a stare. I remember initially thinking he was attractive. Yikes. The way he spoke was short and concise, just ordering a small hot latte. I made his order and that was it. I told my friend about how I thought he was attractive, and we then started referring to him as the small hot latte guy. We always call people by their drink orders. He came a bunch of times after that. Each time staying a little longer and longer, talking a little more and more. One day he came with a woman, presumably his girlfriend. I remember I felt a little weird, like she was staring at me, or like they had spoken about me beforehand. She glanced over at him and said, "Wow, she is pretty." I didn't think much of it, said thank you, served them, and I thought that would be the end of it. He then began showing up and talking to me a lot without her. He started off as being friendly. I honestly don't even know what we'd talk about. Then he got kind of flirty. Initially I was just flattered, but being underage and immature, I didn't even think about the fact that it was kind of alarming. He began to stay for a while. Sometimes he would bring a laptop or a notebook. I could feel him staring at me and listening to our conversations. But at that point I wasn't getting creepy vibes from him, as my coworker and I had dealt with our fair share of creeps. He began by just giving little snacks or drinks. I would accept, but would never eat or drink them. It wasn't that I necessarily thought he had ill intentions, I just had a hard time accepting gifts. I remember one night he brought me a book about one of his favorite artists. I reluctantly took it but had tried to decline before. I remember telling him about one of my favorite musicians and sent him a link to a performance I really liked. He started being kind of sexual while still talking about the song. He then began talking super suggestively, and I would laugh it off and decline when he asked to send pictures. I began talking less and less and told my friend about the situation. She agreed that it was getting creepy and said I should maybe change my schedule. I told her I'd be fine, I'm stubborn. He'd still come every week at closing time, and he'd even stay in his car till we closed. Meaning he'd watch me go to the back to take the trash out. It was time to take out the trash and lock up, so we got ourselves together. I was opening the door while juggling like 3 bags of trash and saw something on the ground. I was confused at first, but then realized what I saw. It was flowers and a note. I felt sick to my stomach and looked around the parking lot. I didn't see his car. I threw them away immediately and told my friend I didn't want to read the note. She read it and told me I had to. It was something to the effect of, "I've never felt so connected to someone. You're breaking my heart. Please don't do this. I'm sorry." Looking back, I honestly didn't lead him on, but initially I felt as if I was in the wrong. Nonetheless, we turned the corner to take the trash out and both prayed the parking lot was empty. It was not. Let's just say the trash was not going to get taken out that night. I continued working there and still worked there on my breaks from college. I had different hours after that. Nothing happened for some time until one day he appeared again, just before I was supposed to leave for college. It was around 3 p.m. It was busy. He came in, stared at me, and then he left. That was the last time I saw him. Looking back, I was so naive and could have handled the situation so much better. I am forever thankful to my friend. She really supported me that whole time. A year ago, I used to post my entire life to Snapchat. It was my go-to app for sharing bits of my life with friends and family. But then something happened that made me reconsider my online presence. One day, out of the blue, I received a friend request from an unfamiliar username. I didn't think much of it at the time and accepted the request without a second thought. It was just another random person, or so I assumed. Months passed, and I forgot about that peculiar friend request. My life went on, and I continued sharing snippets of my daily activities on Snapchat. Little did I know that someone was watching, very closely. It started innocently enough, with an unexpected snap. I opened it, thinking it was probably a friend sharing a funny meme or a cute pet photo. But as the image loaded, my heart almost stopped. It was an eerie, edited version of an old Snapchat story I had posted months ago. Floating love hearts surrounded the image, and the caption read, "Can't wait to see you." The chill running down my spine was hard to ignore. How did someone get access to my old stories? Who was behind this? Days turned into weeks, and more edited snaps kept arriving. Each one featured pictures taken from my past stories. The captions became increasingly unsettling, referring to my personal life. "How was your McDonald's on Friday?" And another said, "I loved that movie you watched last night." The sense of being watched was inescapable. I felt exposed and vulnerable, as though a stranger had invaded my privacy. It wasn't long before I decided to check Snap Maps, the feature that lets you see the real-time locations of your friends. My heart raced as I zoomed in on the map. There it was, a bit too close for comfort, the location of this creep. He was nearby, and the thought sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary prank or trolling. It felt personal, like someone was playing mind games with me. Fear gripped me as I realized the mysterious friend was getting closer to my location. I knew I had to act fast. I began taking screenshots of the disturbing snaps for evidence. Then, I contacted the local authorities and reported the unsettling situation. The investigation that followed uncovered the identity of the creep. To my shock, it turned out to be someone I met at a party months ago. I'd been warned about how creepy and weird he was. He would just invite himself to parties and nobody wanted to be rude and kick him out, so we just tolerated him. To be fair, I had no issue with him and spoke with him a little bit throughout the night, but didn't see much of him. I guess being nice to the social outcast when everyone else kept him at arm's length was enough for him to become obsessed with me. They didn't end up charging him with anything, but they told him to leave me alone and explained to me that I could get a restraining order, but I didn't see the point. This happened a couple of months ago, December of last year. I started working a new job in the mall and had to work for most of Boxing Day. I was done at 10 and transit seemed to have ended at 7. I'm a student who didn't go home for the holidays due to this job and never had to deal with holiday transit hours. I decided to call an Uber and the driver picked me up right in front of the mall. We had a casual conversation during the drive back and he learned about where I worked and how I'm living on my own for the time being since my roommates went to their hometowns. Fast forward to the next day at work, around 6 p.m. This driver walks into the store and tries to strike a conversation with me, but I told him I had to get back to work. He also asked if we could hang out later, to which I said no, and he left. At the end of that shift, I walked out of the store, planning to take transit. As soon as I stepped out of the store, the driver immediately pulled up next to me and offered to give me a free ride back home. After going back and forth with me declining and him saying it's free, I decided to walk away and caught a bus home. I was pretty overwhelmed by the fact that he showed up to my workplace and waited 3 hours until I was done with work to offer me a ride home. I've reported this to Uber and they've notified me that they suspended this driver, provided me with a full refund, and gave me a link to provide to the police if I plan on filing a report. Silly of me to give away information like that to a stranger, but I hope to never meet that driver again. He was about twice my age, he knows where my home is, and my name. Lesson learned.